The box came without explanation. A dead stonemason's papers forwarded from a solicitor in the Welsh borders who had exhausted every other option. I wasn't looking for anything. I was cataloging notebooks, site sketches, material costs, the ordinary residue of a working life. Third notebook, a measurement diagram, a hand chisel, grip width 9¼ inches across, recorded in the same precise drafting hand used for every other figure in the book. A standard adult male handspan is roughly 3½ inches. The notation carried no asterisk, no clarification, no indication that anything about it was unusual. It simply existed. I want to start with something that should have been unremarkable. The tool marks at the base of the eastern foundation wall at Santa Maria della Salute in Venice, documented by a Venetian engineering surveyor in 1841, are consistent with a rotary cutting motion. The surveyor noted this himself. He measured the arc radius at approximately 14 inches, consistent across 11 separate cut surfaces on the same structural block. He had no explanation for it. He filed the notation under surface anomaly, origin unclear, and the report passed into the archive of the Austrian provincial administration that governed Venice at the time, where it remained catalogued and unread for the better part of 2 centuries. What disturbs me most about that notation is not what it claims. It is how calm the surveyor sounds. He was not alarmed. He simply wrote down what he measured and moved on, as though the impossibility did not fully register until after the pen left the page. The conventional explanation for pre-industrial stone finishing of this precision is prolonged manual abrasion. You work the surface repeatedly with finer and finer aggregate over a period of weeks or months, until the grain of the stone is compressed and the finish approaches something like uniformity. That explanation holds for flat surfaces. It holds for gradual curves produced by patient hands over long labor. What it does not hold for is a consistent arc radius of 14 inches, reproduced across 11 non-contiguous cut faces on the same block, because manual abrasion cannot produce consistent geometry without a fixed pivot point, and a fixed pivot point implies a rotational tool, and no rotational stone cutting tool in the documented European craft inventory predates the mid-19th century industrial period by more than a few decades at most. That is the problem, not the finish, the geometry. At the Roslin Chapel complex in Scotland, tool marks on the interior column bases were photographed and measured in a survey conducted between 1891 and 1893 by a structural assessment team commissioned by the Earl of Roslin following concerns about foundational stability. 3 of the column bases showed what the survey report described as lathe-consistent scoring, meaning the cuts followed a helical path at a constant pitch angle rather than the irregular crosshatch pattern produced by hand chiseling. The pitch angle was measured at approximately 7 degrees across all 3 columns. The columns were dated by the survey to the mid-1400s. The survey report was published in a limited architectural journal in 1895. It was cited twice in the decade following publication, then not again. The report itself is held in a private archive in Edinburgh. It has not been digitized. At the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, a partial restoration assessment conducted by the Ottoman administration in the 1870s documented cut surface geometry on the column drums of the original basilica, portions of which date to the 4th century. The assessment found consistent radial scoring on the drum faces at a depth that implied a cutting implement moving under continuous rotational pressure rather than repeated percussive impact. The Ottoman engineers described the finish as not producible by the tools available to the original builders as we understand them. That phrase appears once in the assessment document and is not elaborated upon. The document was submitted to the Central Administrative Archive in Constantinople. Whether it survives in accessible form is unclear. 3 sites, 3 separate continents, Europe, the Middle East, and as I will come to shortly, the Americas. 3 separate centuries of original construction. The same anomaly. The official response to each instance follows the same sequence. The anomaly is noted by whoever discovers it. It is attributed to prolonged manual technique, exceptional craftsman skill, or regional working tradition. The attribution is not supported by any documented working tradition that can actually produce the observed geometry. And then the conversation ends, not because the question was answered, but because no one persists in asking it. In 1867, a structural survey of the Mitla complex in Oaxaca, Mexico, commissioned by the newly reorganized Mexican national government as part of a broader inventory of pre-Columbian monuments, documented tool marks on the interior stone mosaic panels that implied cutting passes of consistent width, depth, and angle across thousands of individual stone pieces. The surveyor, whose report was forwarded to the Sociedad Mexicana de Geografía y Estadística, noted that the uniformity of the cuts across pieces of varying stone hardness implied either a cutting implement that maintained consistent pressure regardless of resistance, or a technique for pre-treating the stone before cutting that was not documented anywhere in the archaeological record of the region. He flagged this as a secondary observation, not the primary subject of his survey, and it occupied 3 paragraphs of a 90-page document. The Society's published summary of his report did not include those 3 paragraphs. What I want to be careful about here is the difference between what was found and what was concluded. These surveyors were not making extraordinary claims. They were technical men conducting technical assessments, and in each case they noted an anomaly, offered the most conservative available explanation, and moved on. The anomaly was not the headline, it was the footnote. That is precisely what makes it worth examining. Because when you look at the footnotes across enough of these reports, and there are more than I have cited here, from a canal surveying report filed in Burgundy in 1853, from a foundation inspection in Kyoto submitted to the Meiji-era Engineering Bureau in 1872, from a harbor reconstruction assessment in Alexandria documented by a French colonial engineering team in 1881, the pattern is not in any single report. The pattern is in what all of them share and none of them explain. The Burgundy report is worth pausing on. The survey concerned a section of Roman-era aqueduct infrastructure uncovered during canal expansion work near Dijon. The supervising engineer documented several cut stone conduit sections showing inner surface finishing. To a smoothness he estimated using the gauging instruments available to him at tolerances of less than 1/32 of an inch across spans of several feet. His note reads, "The interior surface presents a uniformity inconsistent with hand-worked stone. The curvature is maintained without deviation across a distance I measured at 11 feet 4 inches. I cannot account for this by any method I have been trained to recognize." He signed the note. It is dated 1853. The Engineering Bureau filed it with the broader survey submission. It was not referenced in the published summary of the Canal Survey, which appeared in a regional engineering periodical in 1855. Less than 1/32 of an inch, across 11 feet 4 inches of curved stone surface, worked presumably by craftsmen with hand tools, in or before the 3rd century by the structure's estimated date. And in Kyoto, the assessment of a stone drainage channel associated with a temple complex dated to the 9th century found interior surface geometry that the Meiji-era engineer described as not replicable by the chiseling or grinding methods currently in use. His currently meaning 1872, by which point Japanese craft stonework was among the most highly developed in the world. He did not speculate on what method had produced the surface. He measured it, described it, and submitted the document. The document exists in the holdings of what is now the National Archives of Japan. It is accessible to researchers. Almost no researcher has accessed it. The Alexandrian report came from a French military engineering team assessing sections of the old Ptolemaic harbor infrastructure as part of planning for new port construction. The Roman-era stone blocks they uncovered at depth showed fitting tolerances at the joint faces that the lead engineer measured and described as requiring machined surfaces to achieve. His word, machined, used in 1881, well before the word had its current technical meaning, but meaning in his usage that the surfaces had been worked to a degree of precision that implied a controlled, repeatable process, rather than individual hand-fitting. He noted the joint tolerances at less than 1/4 of a millimeter across blocks weighing, by his estimate, several tons each. He filed the report. The construction project proceeded. No further. Investigation of the anomalous blocks was recorded, less than 1/4 of a millimeter, on blocks of several tons, fitted together in a harbor that was in continuous use for centuries, which means the joints held under hydrostatic pressure, salt exposure, and structural load without mortar, because there was no mortar. The joints themselves were the engineering. The pattern, stated plainly, is this. across sites on at least 4 continents, in stonework predating the industrial period by centuries in some cases, and millennia in others. The surviving documentation records surface geometries and joint tolerances that the engineers, surveyors, and architects who measured them could not account for using the craft methods known to be available to the original builders. In each case, the observation was filed. In each case, it was not followed. In each case, the record moved on without explanation. That is not a conclusion, it is an observation. But it is the same observation made independently by trained technical observers across a span of more than 4 decades of survey work on 3 or 4 continents, in stonework attributed to civilizations with no documented contact. At some point, the repetition of the observation becomes the evidence. The weight-bearing joints are where the official explanation collapses most completely. Tool marks can be attributed to exceptional craftsmen. Surface finishes can be attributed to prolonged labor, to regional tradition, to techniques that were simply not written down in the surviving record. Those attributions are unsatisfying, but they are at least available. The weight-bearing joints offer no such refuge because the tolerances involved are not a matter of interpretation. They are a matter of measurement. And when 19th century engineers measured them, several of those engineers wrote down in plain language that they could not account for what they were looking at. A structural assessment of the lower foundation courses at the Pantheon in Rome, conducted by an Italian engineering commission in 1864 as part of a broader survey of the building's long-term stability, documented joint faces between several of the large travertine blocks in the portico foundation at tolerances. The commission measured at less than 1/5 of a millimeter across contact spans of several feet. The commission noted, in language that is almost apologetic in its precision, that achieving such tolerances in stone of that mass without powered grinding equipment would require a surface preparation process they could not identify in the documented Roman craft inventory. They did not speculate further. They recorded the measurements, noted the anomaly, and moved to the next item in their survey. The report was submitted to the Italian Ministry of Public Works in 1865. It was not cited in any subsequent structural literature on the Pantheon that I have been able to locate. Less than 1/5 of a millimeter, on foundation blocks estimated at several tons each. A separate assessment, this one conducted by a British engineering team in 1878, examining the inner chamber construction at the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, found joint tolerances between the inner sanctuary wall blocks that the lead engineer described as approaching the limits of measurement by the instruments available to us. He estimated the contact faces at tolerances of approximately 1/8 of a millimeter across spans of up to 3 feet. He noted that the blocks showed no evidence of mortar having ever been applied, meaning the joint itself was the seal against structural movement, hydraulic pressure from seasonal flooding, and thermal expansion across centuries of temperature cycling. He submitted his findings to the Egyptian Exploration Fund. The fund's published bulletin for that year summarized his structural findings in 2 paragraphs and did not mention the joint tolerances. The full report exists in archival holdings in London. It has not been republished. What I want to be precise about is the nature of these 2 observations taken together. One site in Rome, one site in Egypt, 2 separate engineering teams with no documented contact with each other. 2 separate decades, 1864, 1878. The same finding expressed in the same careful language submitted to 2 separate institutional bodies and absorbed into the archive in both cases without follow-up. The engineers were not making extraordinary claims, they were reporting measurements. The extraordinary part is that no one in either case asked the obvious question. If the tools available to the original builders could not have produced these tolerances, what tools did? The same question presents itself at the Ellora Caves complex in Maharashtra, India, where a survey conducted by the Archaeological Survey of India in 1883 documented fitting precision at several of the load-bearing column bases in the Kailasa temple that the surveying officer described as beyond what the hardness of the basalt and the documented chiseling techniques of the period would permit. The column bases are not decorative elements. They carry the structural load of a temple carved from a single descending rock face, a construction undertaking so improbable that the survey itself was focused primarily on documenting that the structure existed and was stable. The joint tolerances were a secondary observation. They appeared in an appendix. The appendix was not included in the published summary of the survey. The full document is held in the survey's Nagpur archive. 3 continents: Rome, Egypt, India, 1864, 1878, 1883. The pattern is no longer a coincidence of geography, it is a sequence. And here is where the act of simply stacking the evidence begins to feel like something else, something harder to dismiss. Because when you line up the findings of those 3 independent surveys, what you see is not 3 isolated anomalies produced by exceptional craftsmanship at 3 exceptional sites. What you see is a consistent engineering signature, joint tolerances at a precision level that the documented tools of the respective periods cannot account for, found in load-bearing structural elements across 3 separate continents, in stonework attributed to 3 separate civilizations with no documented contact. That is the pattern, it has a shape, and then the scale of the buildings themselves begins to press against you in a different way. I had been reading about tool marks and joint tolerances for some time before I began paying attention to the proportions of the structures themselves. Not their grandeur. The grandeur of ancient monuments is well documented and easily attributed to the ambitions of powerful states. What I mean by proportions is something more specific. I mean the dimensions of the spaces designed for human use. The doorways, the staircases, the thresholds. At the Basilica of Maxentius in Rome, the surviving northern apse presents a doorway threshold set at a height that the standard archaeological documentation records as approximately 22 feet from the floor of the nave to the base of the arch. The explanation given is ceremonial. Large doorways signal power and religious authority. That explanation is available, and I do not dismiss it entirely, except that the threshold height is not the anomaly I am referring to. The anomaly is the step at the threshold base, which is cut from a single travertine block at a riser height of approximately 19 inches. A riser height of 19 inches does not fit a human stride calibrated to the standard adult male leg length, which produces a comfortable stair riser of somewhere between 6 and 8 inches. It fits a stride considerably longer. The building is from the early 4th century. The step has been in place since the structure was completed. No restoration record documents it as a replacement. It is original. At the entrance hall of the Baths of Caracalla, also in Rome, the doorway surrounds of the main caldarium entrance were measured during a restoration survey in 1891 at a clear opening width of 16 feet and a lintel height of 26 feet. The restoration team noted the dimensions in their survey notes. They attributed the scale to Roman imperial ambition, to the desire for monumental effect. That attribution is the standard one. It appears in virtually every subsequent reference to the structure. What the restoration team did not note or did not record in the published summary of their work is that the lintel stones themselves are dressed on the inner face, the face you would touch if you reached up while passing through, at a height that corresponds to approximately 13 feet from the threshold, which is to say the inner face of the lintel, the part that would function as a door frame for a body moving through the space, is calibrated to a height that does not correspond to any Roman occupant documented in the historical or skeletal record. The outer scale could be ceremony. The inner calibration is something else. I want to stay careful here. I'm not proposing a conclusion. I am describing what the dimensions say when you write them down side by side and read them without the interpretive frame already in place. The frame, Roman ambition, ceremonial excess, symbolic scale, is applied before the measurement is examined. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The frame arrives first, and the measurement is read through it, which means the measurement is never really read at all. And Rome is only where the staircase risers and lintel calibrations are most thoroughly documented. The same proportional signature appears elsewhere. At the Hampi complex in Karnataka, India, the Vijayanagara-era audience hall at the Royal Center presents entrance thresholds with riser cuts, measured in an 1896 survey at 17.5 inches, consistent with the Basilica of Maxentius figure within 2 inches across a geographic distance of several thousand miles, and a temporal distance of more than 1,000 years. The survey noted the measurements. The published account of the survey mentioned the hall's dimensions in general terms. The riser height did not appear in the publication at all. The same hands did not build Rome and Hampi. But something shaped both thresholds the same way. The proportional signature extends well beyond Rome and India, and that extension is where the framework begins to assemble itself without being named. At the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, constructed in its current form between 1824 and 1856, the main entrance colonnade presents column bases set at a plinth height of approximately 31 inches from the ground surface to the base of the shaft. A plinth height of 31 inches does not function as a decorative element. It functions as a step, and a step of 31 inches corresponds to a single stride riser calibrated to a leg length considerably exceeding standard adult male proportions. The theater's architects are documented. The construction timeline is documented. The materials are documented. What is not documented is any record of deliberation over the plinth height, any drawing notation that explains why that measurement was chosen, or any alternative measurement that was rejected in favor of it. The measurement simply appears in the finished structure as though it required no justification. At the Palais de Justice in Brussels, completed in 1883 after more than 2 decades of construction, the main hall presents interior doorway openings at a clear height of 28 feet and a threshold width of 14 feet. The Belgian Royal Commission overseeing the project produced extensive documentation of the construction process, materials procurement, labor contracts, structural calculations. That documentation is held in the Belgian State Archives in Brussels and is accessible to researchers. Within that documentation, the doorway dimensions appear in the structural drawings without marginal notation, without explanation of the proportional rationale, and without any record of the architect having been questioned about the scale relative to the building's intended occupants, who were lawyers, judges, and clerks of standard human dimensions. The doors were built, the records moved on, 28 feet of clear height, for a building occupied by ordinary people conducting ordinary institutional business. At the Palacio Legislativo in Montevideo, Uruguay, the main chamber entrance hall was surveyed during a restoration assessment in 1922. The surveying architect documented threshold block risers at 18 inches and lintel clearances at 24 feet on the primary corridor axis. He noted in his survey notes that the proportions exceeded the ceremonial requirements of a legislative chamber, and suggested a design logic he could not fully account for within the documented intentions of the original architects. His notes are in the Montevideo Municipal Archive. The published restoration report summarized his structural findings. His observation about the proportional logic was not included. 3 continents: Moscow, Brussels, Montevideo. Buildings completed across a span of roughly 60 years, attributed to architects from different national traditions, funded by different governments, serving different institutional purposes. The same proportional signature in the entrance thresholds, the corridor lintels, the plinth heights. The same absence in the records, no documented rationale for dimensions that do not correspond to the bodies of the people who used the buildings. And then there is the interior furniture evidence, which I had not initially considered, and which changes the weight of the architectural observations considerably. In the 1890s, a catalog of furnishings removed from the administrative offices of several major European civic buildings during modernization projects was compiled by a Viennese institutional historian conducting an inventory of displaced period pieces. He was not investigating anomalies, he was cataloging furniture. What he documented in a monograph published in Vienna in 1897 and not widely distributed outside of German-speaking institutional circles was a consistent pattern of desk and table heights across pieces removed from civic buildings in Vienna, Prague, and Budapest that measured between 38 and 42 inches from floor to working surface. Standard adult working desk height in the European tradition of the period was approximately 30 inches. The pieces he cataloged were not display furniture. They showed wear patterns consistent with regular use, surface erosion at the front edge, leg joint stress at the base consistent with weight-bearing load, drawer pull wear marks at a height of approximately 35 inches from the floor. The wear marks are not decorative. Wear marks record where hands repeatedly reached. Hands that reached at 35 inches were not attached to arms of standard adult proportions. The Viennese historian noted the height discrepancy in a single paragraph near the end of his monograph. He attributed it to a regional furniture tradition he could not specifically identify. He did not pursue it. The monograph was catalogued by the Austrian National Library and is accessible in their holdings. It has not been cited in any furniture history, architectural history, or material culture study that I have been able to locate. This is where the measurement clusters stop being a list and start being a structure. The tool marks in Section 1 of this investigation implied hands and implements of a particular scale. The joint tolerances implied precision equipment of a kind not documented in the surviving craft record. The staircase risers and lintel heights implied builders calibrating to bodies of a particular proportion. The desk wear patterns imply occupants whose reach height did not correspond to standard adult dimensions. Each observation, taken alone, is an anomaly. Taken together across buildings on 4 continents, separated by centuries of construction history, attributed to civilizations with no documented common origin, the observations form a shape. Not a coincidence, a pattern. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The question the pattern raises is not who built these structures. The question is what logic they were built to express, and where that logic came from, and why the record of it is absent, in a way that is not random but consistent, not accidental but systematic, not the product of time's ordinary erosion, but something closer to a deliberate editorial decision made by people who understood what the measurements implied and chose not to write it down. The same aesthetic continuity runs through the decorative programs of these buildings, which is a dimension of the evidence I want to address carefully because it is the easiest to dismiss and the hardest to explain away once the dismissal fails. The acanthus moldings at the upper column registers of the Bolshoi colonnade match in execution depth and leaf relief proportion. The acanthus programs at the Palais de Justice in Brussels, not in the way that 2 buildings from the same European classical tradition might share a decorative vocabulary, but in the way that 2 buildings executed by the same workshop from the same pattern book might share them. The relief depth is consistent to within a fraction of an inch across pieces separated by nearly 3,000 miles. The leaf turn geometry at the capital angles matches at a level of detail that should not survive the translation from one national building tradition to another. Across different stone types, different craftsmen, different decades, there is a name that circulates in certain research spaces for the civilization or network of civilizations that might account for this aesthetic and structural continuity across sites that official history assigns to disconnected cultures and separate centuries. I am not going to use that name here because naming it tends to close the conversation rather than open it, and what I want to keep open is the observation itself, that the continuity exists, that it is measurable, that it is documented in the records of the engineers and historians and institutional catalogers who encountered it without understanding what they were looking at. The same hands that left rotary cut marks on column bases in Rome and Scotland and Oaxaca and Alexandria, built doorways in Moscow and Brussels and Montevideo to the same proportional logic. The same design intelligence that fitted stone blocks in Karnak and the Pantheon and Ellora to tolerances of less than 1/4 of a millimeter chose desk heights and stair risers that do not correspond to the bodies of the people who later occupied the buildings. The record of how they did any of this is absent, not damaged, not disputed, simply absent in a manner so consistent across so many sites, so many centuries, so many independent archival threads, that the absence itself becomes the most important piece of evidence in the entire investigation. The absence of documentation is itself a form of evidence, and it is the form that is hardest to argue with. When a building stands, it can be measured. When a tool mark exists, it can be photographed. When a joint tolerance is documented in a 19th century survey report, the report can be located and read. All of those things are present in the record, however incompletely, however briefly noted and filed away. But the documentation of process, the manuals, the workshop guides, the master-to-apprentice transmission records that should accompany any sustained craft tradition of the complexity implied by these structures, that documentation is not filed away incompletely. It is not cited rarely. It is, across a consistent range of sites and traditions, simply not there. Consider what the documentation of comparable craft traditions looks like when it survives. The shipbuilding guilds of Venice kept detailed written records of their construction methods from the 13th century onward. The manuscript traditions of medieval cathedral construction in France produced extensive lodge books that documented proportional systems, cutting sequences, and material specifications in enough detail that modern restoration teams have been able to replicate original stonework using those records as primary guides. The Japanese temple carpentry tradition produced written transmission documents, densely detailed, jealously guarded, but physically real, that survive in sufficient number to reconstruct the logic of the system. Craft knowledge, when a living tradition maintains it, leaves traces. The traces are not always abundant, but they are present. The stonework traditions that produced the structures examined across this investigation left no such traces, not incomplete traces, not traces that were damaged by time or fire or institutional neglect. The category of document that should exist, a systematic written record of how tolerances of less than 1/4 of a millimeter were achieved in multi-ton stone blocks, how rotary cut geometry was produced in basalt and travertine before powered equipment, how proportional systems calibrated to body measurements outside the standard adult range were transmitted from one generation to the next. That category of document is absent from the record of every tradition associated with these structures, across Rome and Egypt, Scotland and India, Mesoamerica, and the South American highlands. The record does not thin, it does not degrade, it simply does not begin. That absence has to be explained, and there are two available explanations. The first is that the knowledge was never written down because it was entirely oral and physical, transmitted hand-to-hand through direct demonstration, and that when the transmission chain broke, the knowledge vanished without leaving any documentary trace. The second is that the transmission chain did not break by accident. I am not ready to choose between those explanations. What I want to do first is establish the timeline of when the transmission chain broke, because the timing is not random, and the timing is where this investigation shifts from architectural observation to something with a different kind of weight. The stonemason guilds of Western Europe, particularly those operating in England, France, the German states, and the Italian peninsula, maintained formal organizational structures through the 1700s. Their records from this period, membership rolls, apprenticeship contracts, lodge meeting minutes, are preserved in various national and regional archives and are accessible to historians. The organizations were functional, documented, and in several cases traceable to medieval antecedents. The Lodge of Edinburgh, for example, has continuous documented records from 1599 onward. The Compagnon du Devoir in France maintained formal apprenticeship structures well into the early 1800s with documented enrollment records. These organizations existed, kept records, and produced working stonemasons who built structures throughout the period. Then, across a window of roughly 20 years centered on the 1850s and 1860s, the formal guild structures dissolved, went dormant, or transformed into organizations with different functions. The Lodge of Edinburgh did not dissolve, but its operational character shifted from working craft organization to fraternal and ceremonial body during this period. The Compagnon du Devoir experienced a significant contraction in active membership and documented craft transmission between 1850 and 1870. The German stonemason guilds, the Steinmetzgilden, which had maintained formal craft structures since the medieval period, saw their last formally documented apprenticeship completions in the traditional stonework sense, concentrated in the decade between 1855 and 1865. In North America, the few formal stonemason guild structures that had developed in the major eastern cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, dissolved or were absorbed into general construction labor organizations in roughly the same window, 1850 through 1870. The dates cluster. They cluster in a way that is not explained by any single documented cause. The standard historical account attributes the dissolution of craft guild structures to industrialization. The mechanization of construction processes made traditional handcraft organizations economically unviable, and the guilds dissolved because the work they organized was no longer performed in the way they organized it. That explanation is available, and I do not dismiss it entirely, except that the guild structures that survived industrialization in other craft traditions, woodworking, metalsmithing, glasswork, survived by adapting, by maintaining documentation of traditional methods even as mechanical production replaced them. The stonemason guilds did not adapt in that way. They dissolved, and the craft documentation they held dissolved with them. The apprenticeship records are where this becomes concrete. Through the 1700s, stonemason apprenticeship contracts in England and France routinely included detailed specifications of what the apprentice was to learn, which cutting techniques, which proportional systems, which tool sequences. Those specifications survive in the contracts and give historians a reasonably clear picture of what was being transmitted and how. The contracts from the early 1800s show a gradual shift. The specifications become more general, the technical detail thins, the language of transmission moves from specific craft operations to broader terms like the art and mystery of the trade. By the 1840s, in the contracts that survive, the technical content of what was being transmitted is almost entirely absent from the written record. By the 1860s, formal apprenticeship contracts in the traditional stonemason sense are largely gone from the documentary record in both England and France. Not destroyed, not suppressed, simply not continued. And here's where the first two evidence streams begin to align. The guild dissolution timeline runs from approximately 1850 to 1870. The apprenticeship record thinning runs from approximately 1830 to 1860. The two curves descend together, reaching their terminus in roughly the same decade, in a pattern that does not look like gradual organic decline, but rather like a coordinated withdrawal. Not of people, but of written knowledge about what those people knew. What disturbs me about this is not the dissolution itself. Organizations dissolve, traditions thin, knowledge is lost. These are ordinary features of historical change, and I am careful not to attribute to coordination what can be explained by coincidence. What disturbs me is the specificity of what was lost. Other craft knowledge from the same period survived. Construction knowledge in general survived. This is the era of the great engineering manuals, of systematic documentation of structural calculation and material science. The loss was not of construction knowledge in general. The loss was specifically of the knowledge that would have explained the anomalies this investigation began with. The tolerances, the rotational cuts, the proportional calibrations that the 19th century surveyors could not account for. That specific knowledge, the knowledge that would have closed the questions opened by those survey reports, is what went quiet in the 1850s and 1860s. And those survey reports were being written and filed and ignored in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. The timeline does not establish causation, but it establishes sequence, and the sequence is arresting. The anomalies are documented just as the knowledge that would explain them disappears from the record. Two separate evidence streams reaching their terminus in the same decade, pointing at the same gap. The gap does not have a name in the surviving documentation. It is simply where the record ends and the questions begin. The newspaper record is where the third evidence stream enters, and it enters in a way that is difficult to set aside. Between the 1870s and the 1880s, a cluster of regional and national publications in the United States and Britain reported in the matter-of-fact register of routine local news on construction and excavation discoveries that implied stonework techniques outside the documented craft inventory. These were not sensational articles. They were not written as mysteries. They appeared in the same columns as bridge completions and municipal contract awards, reported by correspondents who seemed to regard the anomalies they were describing as noteworthy but not alarming. The anomaly was named, the dimensions were given, and the article moved on. The Scientific American carried a brief account in its 1874 volume noting the discovery during canal excavation work near the Ohio River of fitted stone blocks at depth, with joint faces described by the supervising engineer as showing surface preparation inconsistent with the hand tool inventory of any documented regional tradition. The account was 3 paragraphs. The engineer was named. The measurements of the joint faces were given at tolerances the article described as remarkable for their closeness. The article noted that no follow-up investigation was planned. The record moved on without explanation. The same publication, in its 1879 volume, carried a notice about a stone conduit section uncovered during utility work in Philadelphia, with interior surface geometry that the excavating engineer described as lathe finished in character. The notice was 2 paragraphs. It appeared between an item about a new steam press design and a notice about harbor dredging operations. No subsequent coverage of the Philadelphia conduit section appears in the Scientific American archive. The conduit section was cataloged and filed away by the city's engineering office. Whether it is still held in that archive is not documented in any accessible record. The Chicago Tribune in the winter of 1882 published a short account of a stone threshold block uncovered during demolition of a pre-existing structure on the north side of the city, with a riser height measured by the demolition foreman at 20 inches and a surface finish described as too smooth for a cut stone of its evident age. The foreman was quoted by name. The block's dimensions were given: 4 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, 20 inches high. The article noted the block had been set aside for examination by a city surveyor. No record of that examination appears in any subsequent Tribune coverage, and the city surveyor's records from that period held in the Chicago Municipal Archive do not include any entry corresponding to the described block: 4 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, 20 inches high, set aside for examination. And then silence. The pattern in the newspaper record matches the pattern in the guild records and apprenticeship logs with a precision that is, by this point in the investigation, no longer surprising but remains arresting. The accounts appear, are noted, and then stop being noted, not because the question was answered, not because a follow-up investigation resolved the anomaly and the resolution was then published somewhere else in the record. The accounts stop because the institutional infrastructure for asking the question, the engineering societies, the craft guild organizations, the professional bodies that might have taken formal interest, was itself going quiet in the same decade. The Smithsonian Institution received at least 3 formal submissions in the 1870s and 1880s, documenting construction anomalies of the type described in the newspaper accounts. This is documented in the institution's own internal catalog records from the period, which are accessible in the Smithsonian archives. The submissions were received, logged with brief descriptions, and assigned to curatorial review. The curatorial review notes, in each case, describe the submissions as falling outside the institution's current research priorities. The physical objects in 2 of the 3 cases were transferred to storage. Their current location in the storage system is not indexed in any accessible finding aid. Not destroyed, filed away. The distinction matters because it keeps the record technically intact while ensuring the record is practically inaccessible. The British Museum received a comparable cluster of submissions in the same period. A structural analysis submitted in 1876 by a surveying engineer who had documented joint tolerances at a pre-Roman site in the English Midlands was logged in the museum's acquisition records and assigned a catalog number. The catalog entry describes the submission as stone samples, with associated survey notes, origin uncertain, craft technique undetermined. The survey notes themselves are listed as accompanying the samples. The samples are listed as held in the geological collections. The survey notes are not listed in any finding aid associated with the geological collections, nor in any other finding aid in the museum's accessible catalog system. They are cataloged, they simply cannot be located by following the catalog. The professional engineering societies complete the institutional picture. The Institution of Civil Engineers in London, whose published transactions from the 1870s and 1880s are extensively archived and indexed, received submitted papers from members documenting construction anomalies of the type under discussion. Several of those papers appear in the submissions log for the relevant years. None of them appear in the published transactions. The submissions log records them as declined for publication, subject matter outside current technical scope. The papers themselves are not listed in the institution's accessible archive holdings. Declined, not preserved, not responded to, simply declined and then absent from the record. When you line up the 4 evidence streams, guild dissolution records thinning through the 1850s and 1860s, apprenticeship documentation going quiet through the same window, newspaper accounts appearing in the 1870s and 1880s and then not being followed up, institutional submissions received and filed without action in the same decades. What you see is not 4 separate phenomena occurring at different rates for different reasons. You see 4 curves descending together toward the same terminus in the same decade across organizations with different structures, different national contexts, different institutional purposes. The convergence does not require a coordinator. That is what I want to be precise about, because the impulse when looking at this pattern is to ask who arranged it, who issued the instruction, who decided that these questions would not be pursued. That framing leads away from what the evidence actually shows. The evidence shows a system, distributed, institutional, operating through ordinary procedures of cataloging and filing and declining, that produced the same outcome across all 4 streams. The knowledge that would have explained the anomalies identified by the surveyors and engineers and demolition foremen went quiet in the same decade in which the anomalies were being reported. What is difficult to explain away is not any single absence. It is the convergence of all of them. I want to say that plainly without dressing it as accusation because the weight of it deserves a plain statement. 4 separate evidence streams, 4 separate institutional contexts, 4 separate mechanisms of record keeping, all of them reaching their terminus in the decade between 1855 and 1875, in a pattern that is too consistent to be accidental and too distributed to be the work of any single decision. The record does not go dark because someone turned off a light. It goes dark the way a building's rooms go dark one by one as the occupants leave, each closing a door behind them, each acting independently, none of them aware of what the building looks like from the outside as the last window goes black. What if the stonemasons were not inventors at all? What if the knowledge that produced those tolerances, those proportions, those rotational geometries, did not originate with the guilds that transmitted it, but was already old when the guilds received it, passed down through a chain of hands that understood the measurements well enough to reproduce them but had lost, somewhere generations back, the civilization that first worked out why those measurements were correct? Not craft knowledge in the sense of a technique developed by practitioners who understood its principles. Inherited knowledge, a set of numbers and sequences passed from master to apprentice the way a prayer is passed. Exactly, carefully, without the theological framework that would explain what it means. That framing changes what the guild dissolution means. If the guilds were inventors, then the dissolution represents a loss of craft skill. Regrettable perhaps, but not strange. Skills are lost when the economic conditions that supported them disappear. The industrial period displaced handstone work, and the organizations built around it dissolved, and the skills dissolved with them. That is an ordinary historical narrative, and it satisfies without raising further questions. But if the guilds were transmitters, not inventors, if what they held was not knowledge they created, but knowledge they inherited from a prior logic they could no longer fully decode, then the dissolution is something different. It is the final break in a chain that ran from a civilization whose structures are still standing to the last man who could produce, by rote and repetition, the measurements that civilization required. When that man died, the chain ended, not because anyone cut it, because the last link was never connected to anything that came after. I think about the old masters in those final guild records, the ones who signed the last formal apprenticeship contracts in the 1850s and 1860s, whose names appear at the end of membership rolls that had run continuously for 200 or 300 years before them. They were not, as far as I can determine, extraordinary men. They had calloused hands and ordinary lives. They knew the measurements because their masters had given them the measurements, and those masters had received them from masters before that, in a sequence that grew more attenuated with each generation as the structures that required the knowledge were built less often and the reasons for the proportions became less relevant. And the apprentices stopped asking why because the masters had stopped having answers. An apprentice who received the measurement of 19 inches for a stair riser from a master in the 1840s would have written it down. He would have used it. He would have passed it on, probably for at least one more generation. But the master who gave it to him could not have explained why 19 inches was the correct figure rather than 17 or 21, because the master himself had received it as a number, not a principle, and the body that the number was calibrated for had not been visible in that workshop for a very long time. This is the part that stays with me, not the conspiracy of silence, not the institutional dismissal, not the newspaper accounts that stopped being followed up. Those are arresting, and I do not dismiss them. But what I find myself returning to is the simpler, quieter tragedy. The knowledge was not suppressed. It was inherited without understanding, transmitted without explanation. And when the transmission finally broke, it left no trace because there was no written record of the underlying logic. Only the measurements themselves, passed from one set of worn hands to the next, carried forward out of habit and professional discipline until there were no more hands to receive them. The guilds that dissolved in the 1850s and 1860s were not custodians of a secret. They were custodians of a memory that had already been separated from its meaning. The memory was the measurements. The meaning was a civilization none of them had ever seen. Why do the staircase risers at sites on 4 continents share the same calibration? Why do the joint tolerances at structures from different centuries and different hemispheres converge on the same figures? Why does the decorative program of a civic building in Brussels share execution depth and proportional Geometry with the program of a building in Moscow built by craftsmen from a different national tradition? Why did the guild records go quiet at exactly the moment the survey reports were being written? Why do 4 separate institutional archives all show the same pattern of receiving these findings, filing them, and not following up? The questions do not have answers I can offer. I have looked for the answers and found only the shape of their absence. The absence is consistent. The absence is measured. The absence is, at this point, the most precisely documented thing in this entire investigation. And then there is the notebook. I have not returned to it directly since the beginning of this account, because the rest of the evidence needed to accumulate before the notebook would carry the weight it now carries. But I want to return to it here, at the end, because it is where this investigation began and because it is, in its way, the most complete statement of everything that has been examined across these pages. The last entry in the notebook is not dated. It appears on what I believe is the final page that was written on, judging by the blank pages that follow. The handwriting is slightly less precise than the earlier entries. Not shaking, not impaired, but carrying the quality of a hand that has been writing for a very long time and is no longer pressing the pen with the same force. The entry is a measurement, a single measurement, a dimension given in inches for what appears, from the diagram beside it, to be the interior width of a structural arch at its keystone, 37.5 inches across, with a notation beside the figure that reads, in abbreviated form, something approximating as given. As given, not as calculated, not as derived from a structural formula or a proportional system the writer could articulate. As given, meaning received, inherited, passed down from a source that is not named in the notebook because it was presumably named nowhere in the tradition that produced it. Because by the time this man received the measurement, there was no source left to name, only the number itself carried forward in a hand that was almost certainly the last hand that would ever carry it. The stonemason who wrote that entry is gone. His notebook passed through an estate and into my possession by the kind of archival accident that occasionally delivers something you are not looking for and cannot set aside. The building that the measurement describes, if it was ever built, is either standing somewhere unidentified, proportioned to a logic its current occupants have never thought to question, or it was never built, and the measurement exists only in that last entry, in that slightly faded ink, on that last written page. The building that produced the measurement, the structure somewhere in the prior civilization's record that this number was originally calibrated against, is still standing somewhere, or its foundation is, or the cut marks of the tools that fitted its stones to tolerances of less than 1/4 of a millimeter are still visible on surfaces that have been surveyed and photographed and filed away by engineers who noted the anomaly and moved on. Nobody has asked the right question yet. Or perhaps the right question has been asked by the engineers and surveyors whose careful notations went quiet in the record, by the apprentices who wrote down the numbers without the reasoning, by the man whose last entry reads as given. And the question has simply never been answered in a form that the record was prepared to hold.